It was all going to end just as he imagined. Right now, standing on the pier, droplets of sea spray softening his hands, with the sound of waves caressing the wooden pillars below. He thought there'd be music for some reason. Silly really, since life doesn't normally come with a soundtrack. But he felt like it would have been right. Some sort of peaceful tune. A gentle, lilting piece, starting slow and then building to one final crashing moment. A fireworks celebration of his life, the whole glorious thing, rolling and dancing playfully as the final moment came and... He felt Summer's arms wrap around him. The waves returned to his ears, her body infused his with warmth, and nothing could have made this moment better. "Are you ready?" she asked. Will nodded. Of course he was. He'd been ready for a long time now. Life with Summer had been the best 6 months of his 17-year life. He remembered her, that first day they'd met, running right into each other at the college library. She was wearing that bobble hat that made her look so endearing and cute. He wanted to take her into his arms there and then. He later nicknamed it her summer hat, and had felt rather proud of that pun despite the fact it was winter wear. After the usual round of apologies, they'd struck up a conversation. Nothing big, just the usual back and forth of, "So what brings you here? What subjects are you studying? Can I add you on social media?" It hardly set the world alight, but first meetings rarely do, except to the people who are actually meeting. Will had never been a book person. He'd only really been at the library to watch YouTube videos on the computer, but the next few weeks had him nearly glued to the shelves, waiting for her to come back so he could accidentally bump into her again. He knew she was special. She was it. The thing that made life worth living. The thing his parents had been telling him about since he was a kid but had never truly understood until then. Life seemed to slow when he was with her, as if the sheer weight of his heart as it pounded away in his chest dilated time around it. He remembered sitting in the small cafe with her on that first date. The giddy thrill at simply being there quickly giving way to something deeper as she described the terrible relationship she'd just gotten out of. He remembered laughing as they stepped out of the cinema into the rain, trying his best to use his jacket as a shield for her. He remembered how she taught him to bring back the joy into his life, how she'd helped him escape the constant bitter argument of his parents and the drudgery of college. He remembered her looking him in the eye just yesterday and telling him how she had never felt so complete in her life, that the memory of her last relationship was gone and how lucky she was to have him. That was when they both realised it was time. Now, here they were, ready to make this their perfect ending. He turned and gazed deep into those bright green eyes. "I've never felt so sure about anything in my life," he said. "I love you." "I love you too," she replied, before casting those eyes down for just a moment. "My parents ended yesterday, just after they said how proud they were of me. Of us." He smiled and took her face in his softened hand. They were great people. It was a good ending for them. She nodded and returned the gesture. "Now it's our turn." They said their goodbyes and kissed for one final time. In an instant, Summer was gone, vanished into a puff of smoke. As the white cloud began to disperse, the words "The End" emerged, round and pink, before drifting down onto the boardwalk. Slowly, Will opened his eyes. He was still here. A sudden vertigo overcame him and he fell back against the railing. He stood there, shivering in the sudden cold, and looked down at the words, "The End." They'd only appeared a few seconds ago, but they'd already begun to crumble into brightly coloured sand at his feet. He reached down and clutched at the last few remaining letters, their brittle forms breaking up as he gripped them. All that remained was dust in his palm, catching on the wind and streaming off into the rolling blackness of the sea. Panic took hold and he stuffed it into his pocket, throwing himself to the ground in a bid to salvage as much as he could. By the time he was done, she was all over him. On his shoes, in his hair, in the creases of his hands. He sat cross-legged on the rough wooden deck for a while, his fingers tracing over the last unreachable crevices where the pink dust remained. She was gone. He was here, and she was gone. It's okay, he told himself. Maybe there's a mistake. Maybe it takes a bit longer for some people. He closed his eyes, composed himself, and waited. Nothing. There can't be nothing. This was his ending. He knew it. There was nothing else in his life to resolve, nothing else to do. He was a complete person. He had to end. That was how it worked. But the moment never came. There was no catharsis, no firework display, no crescendo, just silence and the unstoppable ticking of his watch. He sat there for hours, his face blank and unseeing. It was only the first few drops of rain on his face that prompted him to get up. He buried his hands into his pockets, feeling the remains of summer under his fingernails, and began to stagger home. The lights of his home were out when he walked through the front door. Unsurprising, really. He'd probably walked in midway through his wake. "We'll always remember you, Will," said Dad, bowing his head to a candlelit picture of him. "I always knew you'd figure it out before we did," added Mum, placing a rose by the frame. He wished he could have left them there, let them think that he had ended and moved on to whatever was next. But where else would he go? "Hi," he said. They screamed. "Will!" Mum spluttered. "What happened? Why are your pockets full of sand?" He flopped down onto the sofa, making sure not to spill any of the pink dust in the process, and recounted the whole affair. Their faces twisted in disbelief as they slowly packed up the mural they had made to him and his grand story. It's okay, Will," said Mum after an unbearably long silence. "Lots of people fail to end the first time around." "Really?" "Sure. Happens all the time. My cousin's roommate's friend didn't end until his third character arc. Probably have an even better ending just waiting around the corner." He could tell she was trying to sound convincing, but it was difficult to internalise when Dad's eyes were burning into the back of her head. Another silence. "Look," said Dad. "Are you sure you... Well, are you certain you did everything right?" "What do you mean?" "Well, if you did make some sort of mistake, are you sure you can't make it right?" "Brian!" shouted Mum. "I'm just saying," said Dad defensively. "You know how he went on about her. Anyone would think she was the second coming. It only makes sense they go out together." "We know that, Brian. We all know that. But he didn't do it right, so we've already sunk 80 quid into this wake. He's done. You can't just throw it all in. It sounds like you want our son to end," Mum sneered, jabbing a finger into his chest. "I want him to have a fulfilled arc. That's what every good parent wants. If you want to cuddle him all his life, that's fine by me." "Oh, here we go again." Will watched as the argument escalated and his parents' attention slowly drifted away from him. He slipped away into his room. With the last of his effort, he tipped the sand into an empty Coke bottle and collapsed onto the bed. This was a dream. Some sort of post-credit hallucination. He'd be gone by the morning. Of course he would. His story was over. It wasn't. The next day trudged along and he was stuck like a commuter who'd missed their train, forced to watch as it pulled away. His parents were quieter that week, not just to him but to each other. And he supposed that made sense, as much as he supposed anything anymore. His mind was muted, empty. There was nothing left worth thinking about. He only remembered he had friends when they came knocking at the door asking when his public commemoration was. That night, after a long awkward round of, "Well, good to have you here still," and Yeah, we'd have missed you," he went with them to the local nightclub. Why not? Beat skulking around his room all day. And in fairness, it was quite fun. He danced, he drank, he awkwardly declined the advances of girls drunker than him because he'd just experienced a very sudden breakup and he wasn't sure if he was ready to get back on the horse, and yes, that dress was very nice, but it wasn't going to change his mind. Toward the end, he'd almost entirely forgotten the blunt trauma from the week before. Until he dropped his phone mid-dance. As he reached down to pick it up, a glimmer caught his eye. There was something on the end of his shoe. A scuff of some sort. Dust. Pink dust. Lining the creases of the leather. A weight dropped on top of him. No, this was wrong. Pete found him a few minutes later, leaning against the club wall, eyes fixed on his shoes as the dust vanished into the pavement with every slight movement. "You alright, mate?" He didn't need to reply. He could see the trail. "I'll get it. I felt the same when my girlfriend ended. I just don't get it. What did I do wrong?" Pete shrugged. "I dunno. She was complete and you weren't. You just gotta get on with life. You'll find someone or something eventually." He took a few steps back towards the door. "You coming?" Will wasn't listening. Pete's words were rattling around in his head. "You'll find someone or something eventually." Of course. That was what he had to do. If he could find someone like Summer, less complete than her but with the same general direction, he could try again and get it right. He beamed. His story wasn't over. It was just time for the second act. Without a moment's hesitation, he sprinted away from Pete and the nightclub door. There was nothing for him there. He had a mission to complete. There were so many dating sites out there, it was unbelievable. He signed up to as many as he could, sometimes blatantly ignoring the intended audience, and spent hours on end taking photos of himself from every angle. He spent a week on his description alone, trying to make sure it encapsulated every possible aspect of his personality with mathematical precision. He even hired an analyst to check his like-to-dislike ratio. It felt good, productive, like he was finally taking a serious and mature approach to life. Clearly, this was the real story arc for him. He'd learn to be a proper adult, find the next love of his life by doing so, maybe get married with a mortgage, and then poof! The end. "Oh, this is so romantic," beamed Mum. "Look at my boy, all grown up." "Yeah, it's good to see you make something of your life at last," Dad agreed. His first date was with a girl called Samantha. He'd chosen her specifically because her name started with an S and sounded a bit like summer if you fudged the pronunciation a bit. It just felt poetically suitable. She walked into the coffee shop, the same one he took Summer on with their first date. Her hair was a little blonder than it looked in the profile picture, but that was good because Summer's hair was black, so it was kind of like a yin-yang sort of thing. "Sorry I'm late," she said. "I just had a bit of a problem with it." "It's fine," he said. "So, how are you?" "Yeah, not bad. You?" "Yeah, pretty good." Silence. Well, he thought, this isn't how I was with Summer. He tried again. "So, why were you late?" "Oh, just parking." "Right." They said very little after that. Okay, so it was a bad start. No matter. Next girl was Jenny. It started out promising. She looked a bit like Summer and had a similar sort of disposition, but then she kept going on about her fascination with insects, and he just couldn't imagine a bug fanatic completing his arc. Then there was Francesca. Too solemn. Then there was Jessica, too giggly. Then there was Anne, too hung up on her ex. The dates rolled by, one after another, and none of them were her. He sat there and listened to them chatting on and on about their feelings or things they considered important, just looking for that thing in their eyes, that little hint that they were the one. It never came. Instead, they were just talking, sharing their thoughts and their feelings, wasting his time while he put on a vaguely interested face, trying to fend off the sheer aching hopelessness from swallowing his heart like a pool of black tar. Eventually, he realised he was never going to find her again. There was one date left on his list before the free trials ended and he would have to start shelling out money he didn't have. Her name was, Carol or Kathy or something. He got dressed, gave a nod to the bottle of pink dust he still had on his bedside table, and headed out. If there was one word to describe Carol/Kathy/something, it was... okay. She was attractive, pleasant enough to talk to, but she didn't spike his interest. Not in the way he needed. Still, she was attractive, and she seemed to really be into him for some reason. When the bill finally came up, she caught him with a shy smile. So, you want to do this again? He was about to say no, that he liked her and all, but there just wasn't anything between them, and he wasn't sure she was ending material. But he stopped himself. Hang on. Maybe he was looking at it all wrong. All this time he'd been trying to find another Summer, but maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe he was supposed to learn to love someone he had no real connection with. Yeah, that sounded noble. That sounded mature. It was just the sort of arc someone in his position should be having. He looked back at her. Okay, maybe she wasn't drop-dead gorgeous or anything, but he could learn to love that face, couldn't he? Why not give it a go? He arranged another date. Time passed, as he had now come to terms with it doing, and nothing came of it. There was no spark of light, no fire in his heart to cultivate. He really tried to feel something for her. He went to the coffee shops with her, he told her his secrets, he made sure to go to the cinema on rainy days, he even bought her a summer hat, but nothing happened. Well, truth be told, there was one moment that almost qualified. It was just a lazy Friday evening. They'd ordered Chinese takeaway and she insisted on trying to eat the noodles with a pair of chopsticks. It didn't go well, to say the least. She fumbled with the stick, she dropped half the food back into the box, she was forced to crane her head over ever closer to get anything into her mouth at all. It was so graceless and funny, it became almost charming. She may not have been the person to make him gasp at her beauty or bubble over with emotion at the mere thought of her, but she was nice. She was just one of those people in life, the ones that probably wouldn't be anything special like a great scientist or a famous supermodel, but who nevertheless lived a whole life in all its simplicity and quiet dignity. She was normal, and normal isn't bad. Maybe this was love of a sort. Not necessarily wanting to kiss someone or have sex with them or even really talk to them, but a broader sense of respect for all people in their strangeness and their mediocrity. That was it. That was the realization he'd been looking for. It was mature, it was compassionate, he had it! Now he just had to wait for the ending to happen. Any moment now. But of course it didn't come. He kept on with the relationship for a few more months, though by now the charm he had once discovered was quickly giving way to a low-level irritation. Why couldn't she work out chopsticks? And now he was starting to realise that the whole idea of dating her in the first place was pretty stupid. Learn to love someone you don't even like? What kind of stupid arc was that? He kicked himself for ever thinking it would work. It was the day before her birthday that he finally dumped her, though if he known that at the time, he probably would have given it another week or so. "Look, I'm sorry, Carol," he began, "but I just don't think this is working." "Carol?" she shouted. "Who the hell's Carol?" "Oh," he stuttered. Kathy?" "My name's Kate! You can't even remember my name!" she screamed. "You know what? This is the best news I've heard all week." She turned to the door. "Oh, and since I don't have to put up with you any longer, stop keeping your ex's credit dust in your room. It's not endearing, it's not romantic, it's just weird and gross." And she slammed the door behind her. In retrospect, that could have gone better. Okay, so romance wasn't his arc at all. That's fine. Lots of people have arcs entirely unrelated to getting a partner. He tried something else. At first, it was work. He threw himself headlong into the search for something meaningful. He scoured the internet for hours on end. He meticulously sculpted his CV to be the most perfect thing he could create. He practiced his handshake in the mirror for days at a time. Not an easy thing to practice on your own. And eventually landed himself in a job as the intern of a local insurance office. It was hardly the most glamorous job, but it made for a good start. It would hardly be a good rags to riches story if your rags were only slightly worse than your riches. There were people who worked alongside him. Some were even women his age, but he paid no attention to them. That path led nowhere and he knew it. He made those coffees and filed those papers as if his life depended on it. Every so often he'd be forced to go on a lunch break, but he always ate as fast as possible and made sure to do a bit of cleaning while he was at it. It was mostly credit dust he found himself clearing away. He never realised just how many people ended in this office. Every little clump in the corner or straggling grains in the wall cracks made his heart leap. He'd reach out, careful as anything, and scoop the coloured sand into a small glass tube and capped it with a cork. By the end of the month, he'd usually have a full tube, which he would empty into a recycled jam jar in his room next to Summer. There was something in that dust. He knew it. Some kind of formula that would make it all understandable if he could just look hard enough at it. A year later, after the 12th consecutive Employee of the Month certificate, he moved up from intern to full-time secretary. There was no ending. Another year later, he moved from secretary to consultant. Still no ending. Then he was a team leader, then a sub-middle manager, then upper middle manager, then lower middle upper manager. But still he was here. It was frustrating. It wasn't as if he didn't enjoy the work. Well, it had its good bits. It paid the bills. Mostly. And it wasn't like he could just leave all of a sudden. He'd been with them for 10 years now. Wait, 10 years? Had it been 10 years already? Okay, work wasn't it. What else was there? Friends! Maybe it was friends. The next day, he made sure to bring in a big box of donuts for everyone in the office to enjoy. He took care to learn people's names. He studied the movies they watched, the TV shows they talked about around the water cooler. He went to every post-work meetup, kept up to date on all the gossip, calculated the best stance to take as to achieve a maximum level of affability, and made sure to take small samples of credit dust from anyone who ended so he could treasure their memory. It worked unbelievably well. By the end of his 3-year plan, he was the most popular person in his office by a margin of 63% compared to his next biggest competitor, Gary from accounting. This had to be it. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. Summer was just one person. His love might have been enough to send her into an ending, but what he needed was a larger pool of approval to achieve critical mass. On the day of his 30th birthday, wait, he was 30 now? The office gathered around to present him with a cake. They sang happy birthday to him, they clapped and cheered as he blew out the candles, one of his secretaries gave him a playful kiss on the cheek, even Gary from accounting gave him a firm hug and a pat on the back. And yet... "Come on," he whispered, just as the celebration had reached its peak. "Please." The universe remained stubborn. He could feel the moments slipping away. The sublime was fading and normality beginning to reassert itself. No, please. The chatter turned towards pedestrian things. The dim lights were turned back up, and within a few moments it was as if it never happened. Will sank into his chair. Another 3 years wasted. "Don't worry, dear," said Mum that night. "It'll happen. Eventually." "Will it, though?" Will snapped. "I mean, you've had 3 decades more than me, and you're still here, aren't you? What even is there for you to do anymore?" "Don't you dare talk to your mother like that, you little shit!" shouted Dad. "When are you going to move out? You've got more than enough money. Why don't you stop mooching off other people for a change?" "I've been busy, Dad." He remained stony-faced. Will threw on his coat. "I'm going out." And he slammed the door behind him. By the time he returned, Mum and Dad's The End credits were already half disintegrating, propped up next to a pile of family photo albums. Probably had a heart-to-heart and gone out together. Typical. Just had to rub it in his face, didn't they? His eyes scanned the albums while the letters came undone next to him. What was in those things anyway? It didn't seem like much. Just endless pictures of him as a baby, his first steps, his first day at school. Why look at that? He sighed in frustration. Couldn't even give him any useful tips on the way out. He placed the dust next to Summer on his bedside table. His collection was growing. By now over 15 jars adorned the room, taking up every conceivable space. At least he didn't have to worry about getting his own house now. He could devote his full time and energy to the task of trying to give any of this meaning. Okay, so family, romance, work and friendship weren't it. But there were still options. Plenty of options, right? Of course there were. Every new day another possibility presented itself. Appreciating the arts, was that the point? No. Charity donation, was he supposed to learn to be more generous? No. A missing £5 note, hell, maybe that was the thing he was supposed to be looking for. No. The days blended into weeks. Weeks into months. Months into years. He went to his job, paid his taxes, watched the television, only occasionally unbothered by the utter waste of every second of it. What few friends were left dropped off the map. The last family members vanished, all of them taken by whatever conclusions their life had reached, while he just sat and grew older, knowing he would be stuck here forever unless something changed. "I just don't get it," he said one day. "Sometimes it feels like I actually did end on that pier 30 years ago, but my body didn't get the memo, and now I'm just this ghost, wandering around, searching for a way out that'll never come." "Yeah, life's a bitch like that, isn't it?" replied Gary from accounting, because really he was the only one left who would listen to him. "Sometimes you just gotta get on with it. Just suck it up and keep trucking along." He thumped him playfully on the arm. "It'll probably work itself out. Chill, man." Will rolled his eyes. "Oh yeah, great philosophy there. Chill, man. How the hell do you chill when you know that everyone else has a reason to get up in the morning and all you have is the vague and ever-decreasing hope that something will eventually turn up to justify the last few decades where life has been nothing but an endless slog of disappointments and failures?" He couldn't understand. No one could. What was he even doing talking to him? "Okay, I've got an idea," said Gary from accounting. "I know a guy. He sells stuff, helps people who are going through this sort of thing. Can't promise anything, but, well, he helped me out a lot." He scribbled a phone number onto the back of an envelope and handed it to him. "Oh, and if anyone asks, this never happened." Turns out the contact Gary from accounting gave him was the local drug dealer. As drug dealers go, he was rather nice. He let Will into his house, allowed him to browse the many pills on display, helped him pick the right ones for him, even gave him a first batch free as a new customer incentive. If it weren't for the gigantic scar down the left side of his face and the tattoos of the words kill and hate on his knuckles, he could have easily had a lucrative career as a vacuum salesman. When Will got home and packed away that day's addition to his credit dust collection, he threw a couple of the pills back with a swig of water. He didn't recognise anything at first. No vivid hallucinations, no crazy high, no inflated ego. He almost thought they hadn't worked at all until he looked at the clock and realised that it had been over 3 hours since he last thought of Summer. A smile burst onto his face. This was good. This was really good. He lay back and allowed the pleasant silence to envelop him, staring at the ceiling as he seemed to float up towards it. He was untethered, free, drifting on a soft cloud of nothing. There was no summer, no pier, no work, no ending. He never wanted to come down. He did, naturally. He could feel it happening, feel the cold, dead fingers of summer tapping on his head, feel the weight settle back into him as he realised that he was still trapped here in this slowly rotting... Nope! He stood back up and dived into the bag of pills once more. He wasn't listening to that voice any longer. The buzz was difficult to maintain sometimes. It only took a few minutes of forgetfulness and he would start to feel the chemicals draining from him. But a simple timer system on his phone took care of that minor concern. Life became so much more bearable with the pills inside of him. He coasted to work, gazed vacantly at his screen for a few hours, went home, watched some mindless TV shows, went to bed, woke up, did it over and over again. He didn't care about anything. The dirty dishes, the laundry piling up, the unpaid bills, the bailiffs knocking at his door, the fact he got fired several weeks ago but kept showing up to work anyway, none of it mattered in the slightest, just so long as he kept that steady stream of pills flowing through him. He had to keep the pills coming though. He had to do that. One day, God knows which, the timer went off as usual but the bag was empty. Oh, okay. Must be time to refill, he thought. He rummaged through his backpack, empty except for the jars of credit dust. Oh, okay. I'm broke, that's it. That's bad, isn't it? Wait, why am I lying in the streets? Am I homeless? What's going on? A creeping terror began to take hold. His breath quickened, his hands shook. No, not good. Not good. Need pills. Need money. Need pills! His eyes darted around, briefly catching his reflection in a puddle. Did he have a beard now? A voice began to whisper in his ear, soft and feminine. Don't shut me out again, Will. Don't leave me. Why didn't you end with me, Will? He ran, aimlessly, frantically, his cracked, unused voice wailing, Shut up! Don't make me think of you! She was everywhere. Taunting him, calling him. He couldn't escape it. He knew he couldn't. It would come back again and again and... Wait! There was a pharmacist on the horizon! They had pills! He burst through the door and began to fling them off the shelves, cramming as many as he could into his mouth. Cold and flu pills, headache pills, period pills, anything he could find. Women screamed, babies cried, security was called. Maybe this is your arc, he thought. Maybe it ends with you overdosing and... He was only able to get a few more pills into him when he was wrestled to the ground and a single gag dislodged the majority of them. He lay there, feeling the hollowness in his stomach, listening to the flurry of mobile phones desperately dialing 999 and, despite it all, still couldn't help but anticipate a puff of smoke that never came. From there it went more or less as you would expect. He was arrested, put in prison, and placed on a rehab program. He looked around the room, examined the haggard faces next to him, and... Wait, was that Gary from accounting? Oh, hey, Will, said Gary from accounting. He nodded in response and asked what they were in for. Oh, you know, same as you. Got hooked on the pills, ran out of money, murdered the dealer, tried to flee the country, got into a shootout with the cops, but got a good enough lawyer to get away with just this. Yeah, the usual. Will didn't speak to him after that. He went about the program, going through the motions, when suddenly something hit him. Of course, it was so obvious. This was his arc. His life hadn't been an endless struggle to find a story. It was all part of a larger whole, getting over the ending of summer. He'd distracted himself with all these things so he didn't have to confront the trauma he'd encountered, and now it was time to get clean and move on. He beamed from ear to ear. This felt real, more real than anything had ever been. The routine was rigorous, cold showers in the morning, counselling in the afternoon, room inspections at night, but he grew used to it. Day by day he could feel his mind clearing. The hazy, multicoloured blur of the drugs became the sober white light of a doctor's office. They helped him get his job back, make new friends with his fellow patients, and put his name down for a new flat in the city. On a bright, crisp Sunday morning, the doors to the rehab centre opened and he stepped out into the sunlight. He took a few tentative steps into the gravel driveway and breathed the fresh, clean air, letting it fill his body and mind. This was it. A new life awaited him. He smiled, ready to face it. He'd been expecting... No, of course not. No, he actually had to go and live some of his new life first. Then Gary from accounting ended right next to him. Okay, that's fine. Different arcs for different people. He went home, returned to his job, paid his taxes, watched TV. Nothing happened. It had to happen. He was over. He was supposed to be over. That's the end, surely. It felt so much like the end. Why wasn't it the end? In a moment of quiet desperation, he glanced over at the growing collection of credit dust and gave a sigh of defeat. He sat back in his chair, closed his eyes, and resigned himself to the oncoming years. Life became an ever-accelerating blur after that. He stopped fighting the urge to remember her. Every day a new iteration of that night on the pier would float through his mind, each one more divorced from reality than the last. Sometimes she would be mocking him, cackling with malicious glee as she dissolved into those two little words. Sometimes she would be smiling, assuring him that he would join her one day, but no matter what, he always ended up alone. The few people he gained in rehab left him, as everyone always did eventually. The people in his office disappeared one by one, replaced by other faces he barely even bothered to remember. The final remains of his wasted youth fell away like the last wilted leaf off a tree. He retired, not even surprised when the handshake and golden watch didn't make him disappear, and moved into a retirement home with his crate full of jars. And there he sat for days on end, watching the tiny little TV in the corner as it flickered like a newly ignited match, with images of fresh young faces finding their perfect lives, or great heroes achieving impossible feats of bravery, or quirky old people having one last playful romp before vanishing for good. He sneered at them all, sneered at their naivety, their immaturity, their utter and undeniable beauty. There were only a dozen residents in the home, but sure as anything they vanished too. Their eyes would gleam with fresh life as their families came to visit, as they smiled and hugged and talked about nothing. They'd reminisce on old times and occasionally just end there and then, just like that. 1 minute they were talking and then poof, the end. That was the part he hated the most. What could they have possibly gleaned from just sitting there doing nothing? It was hopeless to try and find out. He knew that now. It wouldn't work on him anyway. But it was on one of these ordinary days that the answer finally found him. It started as usual. He woke up in his tiny room, surrounded by jars and pots and bottles of dust, over 100 specimens now. He grabbed his newspaper, read the obituaries, silently cursed each and every one of the lucky bastards, lugged his shriveled body downstairs and lowered himself into the same old creaking armchair. The TV played its usual tunes and flashed its usual images, and his mind began its usual wandering. Summer, the pier, his parents performing his wake, going to bed and wishing it was over. It was an old pattern now. Almost comforting, though the track was so worn in that the details vanished. Did Summer have blonde hair or black hair? There was so little left in his mind now. It was all mushed together like the collapsing letters of a The End credit. Was there anything new? Anything he hadn't gone over so many uncountable times? You coming? The words hit him like a flick between the eyes. What? It was Pete, his old friend. They were outside the club shortly after summer ended. He was gesturing for Will to come back into the club. He'd turned it down, hadn't he? Run off to pursue some doomed attempt to find another soulmate. He should have gone with him, for all the good it would have done. He closed his eyes and tried to remember it clearer, tried to recall every detail, praying he could somehow turn back the tide and make himself walk through those doors. That night at the club was the last damn time he was properly happy, properly able to be free from himself, and... There was a buzzing noise behind him. A fly was skimming across the corner of the room, zipping this way and that, bouncing off the walls, off the windows, looping back on itself and spinning aimlessly. He chuckled. I know how you feel. I've been doing that my whole life. Wretched, isn't it? But it wasn't. The fly kept going, kept hitting walls, kept throwing itself out. It wasn't miserable, he realised. It didn't care if it never went anywhere. It flew simply to fly, revelling in its little existence in all its apparent pointlessness. He kept watching, fascinated in a way he hadn't been for decades. The fly swooped around in a figure of 8 and came to settle on the handle of the back door. Will blinked in surprise. How long had that been there? You coming? Said Pete again. Will approached the door and cautiously pushed it open. The fly shot past his hand and out into the brilliant daylight beyond. He took an uneasy step out into the garden, staring with wide, youthful eyes at the lush greenery around him. Had this always been here? He sat on a small wooden bench, feeling it creak beneath him. His senses suddenly filled up. The bright colours, the sounds of the birds, the smell of the roses, the gentle breeze on his face. There was so much around him. Something inside gave away and the grime of his thoughts cleared in an instant. How much of this had he missed when he was trying to find an ending? How many people had he pushed away in a pointless search for some sort of grand catharsis? He'd been holding down the fast-forward button on his own life and never realised it. Oh, how could he have been so stupid, so vain, so... The breeze caressed his face again, bringing him back to now. Everything else seemed to drift away like credit dust into the wind. He laughed at the analogy and took a deep breath in. To hell with endings. They're overrated anyway. And he sat for a little longer, drinking in the world around him, making up for lost time.